There's a sort of open secret held by some pastors that I know, a bit of a deception. Sometimes when pastors, say, are on a plane or somewhere out among strangers, and someone asks what you do for a living, it's possible that you don't answer with complete honesty. I've heard some pastors say that they are writers, or others perhaps counselors or teachers. Now, these are all pieces of what they do, after all. It's not really that pastors are embarrassed of being pastors, at least I don't think so, but that people have a lot of assumptions about the church and Christianity and what pastors are like and what they obviously must believe. And sometimes you have a good book that you want to read on a plane, and you really don't want to accommodate whatever will come along with the admission that you're a pastor, whether it's uncomfortable silence, or a person unloading their problems, or an evangelical conversation completely out of line with your theology. Now, I don't wear my clerical collar hardly anywhere. And I don't make a big point of announcing that I'm clergy, but I'm also a horrible liar. So this isn't something that I do. But on planes, I'm usually wrestling kids, and no one is stopping to make small talk with me about what I do for a living. But I do know that discomfort that some pastors sidestep in those moments. I left a dentist once, in part because of the assumptions made about me and my beliefs as a pastor that I couldn't dispel with that person's fingers in my mouth as they cleaned my teeth. To be honest, though, even without the teeth cleaning, it can be hard to figure out where and how to say, the Christ I believe in is not seeking primarily personal piety or righteousness or memorized Bible verses. I'm not preaching about individual salvation. I believe that Christ calls us to seek justice and love, to work for peace. The gospel I preach is the salvation for all in the liberation of the oppressed here and now. I rarely find that opening, because there's such a strong assumption that we all must believe the same thing as Christians, that Christianity is a monolith. The national staff of the UCC have lamented what they have at times called our church's greatest sin, which is that the UCC is the best kept secret in Christianity. While we mourn dying churches and dwindling numbers of Christians and members in the UCC, our research actually shows that open and affirming churches who are loud and proud in their O&A mission are growing. So there's really no reason for us to be shrinking, no less dying, unless we are not proudly proclaiming and living our beliefs. I believe so strongly in the values and theology of our church, and yet we struggle to make our voices heard, to say, here's the good news that we receive from Christ. It's one of the primary points of our strategic plan as a church, bravely speaking out for justice. I don't think we are shy about justice. It's just that it's incredibly hard to overcome the narrative in our culture about what Christianity is, so that our message of justice is paired with the core message of Jesus and the church as the radical, life-changing gospel. The story we read today from 1 Samuel is a well-loved story by many about God calling a new leader. "Here I am," he replies. We often stop this reading when Samuel says to God, "Speak, for your servant is listening." His response here is a beautiful example for us to strive for as we seek to listen to God still speaking. But that's actually the middle of the story. When we read on, we hear the difficult word that God has for Samuel. We hear Samuel's response to that difficult word. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Eli is to Samuel more than a pastor and a mentor. Eli has been a guiding influence in Samuel's life since before his birth. You'll remember that Hannah is Samuel's mother. Hannah spent years unable to conceive a child. And so at the temple, she prayed for a child, weeping to God. When Eli saw her hysterical prayers, he thought she was drunk. But after hearing her distress, he blesses her. And Hannah later gave birth to Samuel, this child she had longed for years. Hannah had promised God that if God would give her a child, she would dedicate that child to God. And she is faithful to her promise. Samuel is given to Hannah by God, and Hannah, as she had promised, gives Samuel back to God, entrusting him to Eli's care as a young child. Samuel is a double gift from God and back to God. Can you imagine the way that Hannah must have spoken to Samuel about Eli? As she lovingly held her baby and then later toddler in her lap, I imagine her telling him stories about the priest who heard her cries and blesses her. Through Eli's blessing, God gives Hannah a child. Samuel must have very great regard for Eli. And then he becomes even more to Samuel, because as a young child, Hannah follows through on her promise and dedicates Samuel to God. And this means that Samuel now lives in the temple. Eli is his guardian and mentor who raises Samuel and teaches him the duty of the priests. Eli becomes like a parent to him. Then comes this call from God, a vision at a time when visions were not widespread. Samuel has not yet learned to discern God's voice. It takes several tries for him to attune to God's voice. When he does, God's message is difficult. God is about to punish Eli's house forever. I wonder how old Samuel is in this story. We know he's still a boy. Perhaps he's only 8 or 9. God says, tell your mentor, your pastor, your guardian, your parent, he will be punished. He and his whole house forever. Samuel is called to do more than speak truth to power. He is called to speak truth to the one he loves and respects. We uphold speaking truth to power as a great and honored role of the prophet, something Jesus also calls us to do. It's not an easy role, and it's harder yet to do well, to do it in such a way that the truth can be heard and received. But speaking truth to the ones that you love and respect, I think that's harder still yet. To me, that role feels even heavier. For Samuel, at least Eli knows that God has been speaking to him, that the word Samuel has for him comes from God. When we are called to speak difficult truths to those we love and respect, we don't have that same advantage. In fact, to make things more difficult, we have the baggage of a version of Christianity and Christ and God that has been projected into mainstream culture that shares little in common with the gospel that we believe. And yet, Samuel is not unfamiliar with that particular struggle. Eli and his household are the priests. They are the church, or more accurately, the temple. God calls Samuel to a tumultuous time to be an agent of change. The story of Samuel's life and of the Israelites at that time is a reminder that no institution can save us. Even religion can't save us. Only God can do that. When Samuel is born, the Israelites are ruled by judges, a system of governance given by God to guide God's holy people. But it fails. And Eli and his household, the religious leaders of the Israelites, have also failed. Samuel becomes an essential leader in establishing a new system of governance, kings over Israel. And spoiler alert, the kings will fail also. If politics and governance could not save the Israelites, God's chosen people, politics will not save us. That's not to say they are not important. Politics can do tremendous harm. Politics can destroy people and nations. And politics can do good, but it cannot save us. Only God can save us. Institutions won't do it. Even religious institutions, only God can. And yet, in and through our imperfect religious institutions, God is still speaking. And God is speaking outside the church too. And God is calling us to speak difficult truths in love to those in power and to those we care deeply about. For God is calling forth radical change, rooting out evil. God is calling us to forge new paths, to unseat oppressive systems, to disrupt systemic injustice in the forms of racism, sexism, ableism, classism, and all those other isms, to overturn systems of climate destruction. We look around and there is so much at stake, so much that needs change, so much hurt and fear, and such strong foundations keeping the same old systems in place. And yet God chose to call a child and call again and call again until the child could clearly hear God's voice. Though the message from God overturned all that Samuel knew, and though Samuel was afraid, he spoke. As the world he knew crumbled around him, Samuel trusted in the one who redeems humanity, who never leaves or forsakes us, who is the Alpha and the Omega, who abounds in steadfast love. The one who is love. And God led Samuel, and God will lead us to move past our fear, to move into and through change, and to love the world, love our neighbors, love our enemies, into God's dream for a more just world for all. Let us listen for God's call and discern God's voice through the din of the world, and let us bravely speak out for justice as we place our faith in God alone. Amen.